Awesome. So thank you, Michelangelo. That was a really awesome presentation, and I'm really excited that it's being recorded because I think that's something super awesome for people who aren't lucky enough to be in this room to see. Also, thank you, Michelangelo, for being an awesome Jovian and making that directory open source and available to everyone. Um, we all hear all the buzz about big data, but this next speaker is going to talk about something that's, I think, is even cooler, tiny data. So we have Henry, who's going to be speaking to us about applications of the notebook in nanotechnology. And after that, we will break out for some noms. So I will give it up to Henry now.
All right, first of all, I want to thank everybody for sticking around to the very end to hear my talk. My name is Henry Hinnefeld. I'm a PhD student down at the University of Illinois. And today I'm going to talk a bit about how we've been using Jupyter Notebooks to do the data collection in our lab. The talk is structured kind of in reverse title order. So first, I'll give a little background on our lab and the kind of research that we do. Next, I'll introduce our old data collection process and the problems that we had with it. And finally, I'll talk about how we solved all of those problems and made everything way better using Jupyter Notebooks. So, big picture, our lab does electrical measurements on nanoscale devices at low temperatures and high magnetic fields. So we're interested in things like the electrical resistance, currents, voltages, measuring those kind of signals on devices that at the smallest get down to about 50 nanometers. So to put that into some context, the average human hair has a diameter of about 50 micrometers. So these devices we're making are, at the small end, 1,000 times smaller than human hair. The temperatures we do these measurements at range from about 4 Kelvin down to 50 millikelvin. Here, for context, you can think of outer space. Outer space is 2.7 Kelvin. So on the toasty end, our measurements are about as cold as outer space. And on the cold end, they're about 100 times colder. And finally, the magnetic fields we use get up to about 9 Tesla. And here, for comparison, you can think of an MRI machine, the one that'll like rip an earring directly out of your ear. That's about 3 Tesla. So we're 3 times as strong as an MRI machine. This is basically our deal. We make these little tiny devices, and we subject them to extreme conditions, and then we look at how their electrical properties change. This is what that looks like in practice. So I'm going to kind of like walk through our physical measurement stack, if you will. This is an electron microscope image of one of my devices. The important things to look at are the darker H-looking shape in the middle. That's a piece of this interesting material whose properties I want to study. And then the 6 triangular-looking things coming in from the edges, those are electrical leads that will carry the signal to this little device. So in this experiment, I might run an electric current through the 2 middle horizontal ones and then measure the voltage difference between like the top ones or the bottom ones or the left ones or the right ones, something like that. The material? It's graphene, if you've heard people talk about that. So we make a couple of these little devices on some silicon chips. This chip here is about a ½ centimeter to each side. And it's a little small, but you can see there's kind of a 3x3 array of things in the middle. So there are 9 of these little devices on this chip. So we take the chip, we put it in this little holder and attach some very, very tiny wires from the holder to all of the electrical leads on the chip. And then attach the holder to the bottom of this thing that we call the cold finger. So the chip gets mounted, do I have a mouse pointer? Yeah. The chip gets mounted down here at the very bottom, and then there are a bunch of wires and tubes and stuff that run from the top all the way down to the bottom that carry the electrical signals, and then a bunch of cooling liquids like liquid nitrogen, liquid helium, various gases, and vacuum, and all kinds of stuff up and down the length of that. That gets inserted into the blue cylinder here, which goes way down into the floor. There's a big electromagnet down at the bottom, and the top seals, and we pump it out to a nice low vacuum. And finally, we hook this up to some of our fancy electronics so that we can run signals from our electronics down through the cold finger, through all the wires, and then finally through the device. Now, I'm guessing that what I've described so far is a little outside the day-to-day data science, analytics wheelhouse, but a little bit maybe. But I want to make the argument that in an abstract sense, doing this kind of research is just like doing an exploratory data analysis. In that when I'm doing these measurements, I really want to be able to iterate. Brian mentioned this, some of the other talks have mentioned this, that when you're doing a data analysis, you really want to be able to iterate, to try something, see how it worked, go back and try something different. And that's exactly what's happening when I'm doing these measurements. I know basically what I'm looking for, but I do my first measurement, and I say, oh, you know what, this is the region in the magnetic field where it looks like it's doing interesting things, so let me zoom in on that. Or maybe I say, you know what, magnetic field isn't showing me what I want to see. Let me switch and try a different axis. Like, let me look at the temperature axis or the gate voltage axis. It is just like exploring some new data set, except the data doesn't exist. You're making it up. You're collecting it as you go along. Okay, so that's the exposition. That's the backstory. Now it's time to introduce the bad guy in this story. National Instruments LabVIEW. So for those of you who aren't familiar, LabVIEW is a graphical programming language aimed at people who need to interface with hardware. So people doing industrial or academic research or testing. Just quick show of hands, has anyone used LabVIEW before? All right, keep your hand up if you enjoyed the experience. All right, 1 or 2 takers. So to be fair, LabVIEW does have some redeeming qualities. Some, as villains go, it's a complex villain. Think Kylo Ren instead of Darth Vader. So I pulled a couple lines from the promotional material on their website. First, it actually is pretty easy to visualize data with LabVIEW. You do a measurement, you slap up a plot, you can see what it looked like quickly. It is also easy to talk to hardware with LabVIEW. That's the whole selling point, basically. It's an industry standard, so any piece of equipment that you buy, the manufacturer is going to provide a LabVIEW library for it. This last part, the intuitive graphical programming syntax. This is what that looks like. This is actual LabVIEW code that people in my lab actually use. So for those of you who are saying, what the hell am I looking at? Well, each of these little boxes is either a variable or a function, and each of those little wires is taking a value from a function to a variable, or the output of a function to another function, or to a variable or something. So all of the logic, all of the control of a LabVIEW program is tied up in how these little wires connect these little boxes. It is literal spaghetti code. Now, I think you can start to see the problem with this. When we're doing these measurements, we want to be able to iterate, to try something, change something, try something new, see how that worked. And past a certain degree of complexity, it is impossible to modify a LabVIEW program. If I wanted to change something in here, like swap out a different piece of equipment, I'd have to cut out all the little boxes, put in a bunch of new boxes, reconnect all the wires, and make sure that the flow of the program was exactly the same. What ends up happening is that we have a unique LabVIEW program for every possible type of measurement and every possible equipment configuration that we want to do in the lab. That is the opposite of being able to quickly iterate on something. So if LabVIEW is the bad guy, obviously Jupyter Notebooks are the hero of this story. And they're the hero because they give us this nice foundation that replaces most of what we get out of LabVIEW. First, super easy to visualize stuff. Just a little inline matplotlib, you're golden. You're good to go. Also, they use Python, which is a non-insane programming syntax. The only problem is that out of the box, a Jupyter Notebook is not going to talk to my dilution refrigerator or my lock-in amplifier or my fancy multimeter. I thought about pitching a sprint session for that, but it seemed like low appeal. So what we did in our lab is we made up a sidekick for the Jupyter Notebooks in the form of a suite of instrument modules that talk to each of our instruments. And this is actually where the bulk of the work in this project went. Fortunately, the Python ecosystem is well enough developed that even in this case, a lot of the work was done for us. We have instruments that communicate over a couple different types of interfaces. There's some TCP ones, a couple different types of serial interfaces. But fortunately, there are already Python modules that talk over all of these interfaces. So all we had to do was go in the manual, look up what kind of commands the instrument was expecting, and then just write a little Python wrapper that sent those commands. And one real advantage of doing all of this by hand, custom for ourselves, is that we could standardize the API across all of the instruments that we're talking to. So we came up with a really simple scheme that really just has 3 basic parts. Each instrument module has an internal data store that keeps track of the data we're measuring with that particular instrument. Each one has a suite of set parameter methods, so things like magnetic field, set the temperature, set the voltage, or whatever. And finally, a read point method, which takes a single measurement using that instrument with whatever configuration we've defined so far. And this is really handy because it makes our new setup really, really modular. One of the great things about Jupyter Notebooks is how you can just kind of drop in everything else you need. You know, drop in a little matplotlib, little numpy, little pandas, little scikit-learn. And now we have that same kind of just drop in things as we need it with all of our different instruments, like our lock-in amplifier, or our fridge, or our fancy multimeter. So I want to walk through just like a quick example of how nice this new modularity is. This might be a little hard to read, but this is just a basic script to do a magnetic field sweep with our new setup. So we pull in the modules, define our variables, do a little bit of configuration stuff, and then the field sweep is just a little for loop. We set the field to some variables, set field, and then read a point. So let's say I do this measurement, and I look at my data, and it is super noisy. It's just bouncing all over the place. Well, we actually have specific hardware that's really good at getting a signal out of noisy data. So I go and I swap in that different piece of hardware for the one I was using originally. All I have to do is change about half dozen lines of code here, pull in a different module, define a different variable, do slightly different configuration, and then it's the same. It's just a slightly different variable in the same read point function. It's like 15 minutes later, and I'm back in business. Compare that to modifying a LabVIEW program. You remember the horror show I showed you before? That's actually only this little highlighted part. If I wanted to switch out what instrument I was using with this old LabVIEW program, I would have to go in and find every single box that was a function for that old instrument, cut it out, put in a new box for the new instrument, wire it up, hope that they interact in the same way. This is why we have to have a different LabVIEW program for every single type of measurement that we want to do. There are a couple other advantages. Really, the main one is it's possible to read the Python code. I never thought named variables and named functions were a luxury until I started working in LabVIEW, but they are. Since this is scientific research, it's really important that we be able to repeat what we did, and that is baked right into the notebook format. If I'm doing an experiment, I can take each measurement in a new cell, save the notebook, and that is an exact record of what I did. So if I need to go back and do it again, duplicate my results, I just load up the notebook, run all my cells, and that is guaranteed to be exactly what I did last time. One other thing, this isn't so much notebooks are great as LabVIEW is terrible, but the way you do variable assignment in LabVIEW is you run a little wire to a box, and it's really easy to end up with a situation where you run a wire to a variable box up here, and you read from that same variable box somewhere else and get yourself a nice little race condition. So even individual measurements, let alone the whole experiment, even individual measurements are much more repeatable with this Python setup. And finally, there is so much less duplication of effort. The nature of grad school is that people are always leaving. People are always graduating. Fingers crossed. So you're always working with something you inherited from someone who's not around anymore. There's never somebody there who can say, oh yeah, I did this for this reason. But now with these notebooks, you can put a little markdown text and say, I'm doing this measurement. I did this weird thing because of this. And also, LabVIEW comes out with a new version every 2 or 3 years, which usually breaks backwards compatibility. So literally, it's better in just about every possible way. That's about all I have to say about how our lab has been using these for data collection. But before I end, I want to make the point that really the things that make notebooks really useful for us in our data collection, I think are kind of broadly applicable. It's the combination of iterative modification and immediate feedback that make these so useful for us, and that's really what you need in all kinds of data collection scenarios. So I think notebooks are a really good tool to use if you're trying to like work out a little web scraper thing, or if you have one of those fancy Nest thermostats to collect a little data about your house or about your fitness, if you have a Fitbit or something. You just write up a little Python module that talks to whatever you're trying to get data at, and then with the interactivity and the feedback of the notebook, you can really quickly get a good idea of how to collect the data that you want to collect. So that's all I have. Thanks for listening. Got a few minutes for questions.
So as an outsider, this seems like a movie with a villain that's really hard to root for, but did you have skeptics, that people that didn't want to move, that you were and how did you go about it?
That's a really good question. The prevailing sentiment, at least within our research group, was the people who already have their like 10 or 15 LabVIEW programs that do the measurements that they want to do. They're like, fine, I've got my stuff, I'm going to stick with it. But the younger students that don't already know how to do LabVIEW and don't already have those things set up to do their measurements, they're like, if I have to learn one or the other, I'm definitely going to learn Python. So there's kind of the entrenched interest of people who already do it the one way, but people who are coming in fresh are definitely persuaded. I do want to make the point that this isn't like a global replacement for LabVIEW. LabVIEW does do some things that this Python stuff can't really do as well. It's not super fast, so if you're trying to do things that need you to communicate with the instrument really, really snappy, Python's not going to work great. And you do have to put in the effort to write up these Python modules, which is a non-zero amount of effort. And with LabVIEW, it's the industry standard, so there's going to be a library. So it's really a question of kind of like intercepts versus slope, if that makes sense. You have a question?
Are you studying D-Wave or S-Wave superconductors as an experimental setup?
I'm not doing superconductivity stuff. Other people in our group do. I'm looking at, so graphene is this two-dimensional material that has really interesting properties, and I'm looking at how some of those properties change when you like stretch it in interesting ways or put it on top of different substrates that have fancy properties.
Have you tried providing the Jupyter Notebook as an appendix of research papers?
I haven't finished a project since starting this yet.
Okay.
So I actually have a comment about that.
Sure.
So our lab is entirely running Python as well.
Yeah?
So we usually
What kind of lab?
I'm working on computing.
Okay.
So typically we'll have like the experiment stuff like written as a Python module. We'll have like a PyCharm and the notebook open side by side. So the fact that you have like a Python, a very large, heavyweight Python module with all of the drivers like outside the notebook context makes it kind of difficult to share. But usually we'll just package it up in the repository and share it.
Yeah.
So I'm a material scientist as a background, but I'm curious. Like I never used pandas until I started doing like normal data science. And you mentioned pandas in here. Are you guys using pandas in your analyses in any great way?
I am, but
There's not many, right?
right. I'm trying to evangelize for Python a bit because it's way easier to pull it into pandas and then like plot some columns than manually pull your text files into Origin, which is another plotting program, and then like by hand say plot these two columns. So I absolutely think we could be. It's just a question of there being familiarity within the research environment.
And definitely a thing worth exploring is either start at the base trig level or go on to full widgets. But having wrapped some oscilloscopes and some radar warning receivers and things like that, it's incredible to be able to give people live visualization. So you would keep your same API, but each of those data methods inside of it would become an evented thing that other stuff can listen to in your UI.
Okay.
And so then you can get back to what LabVIEW did great, which is to give
Yeah.
But take a picture, you know, like you can have all those things back
Uh-huh.
so that the notebook you ship is not 18 lines of code. It's pick which of my 6 machines is connected, pick which of the methods I want to use, sweep over this. I'm gonna go get a coffee. You know, like
Yeah.
that's what we want to get to.
Yeah, I tried playing around a little bit with like some widgets, but like somebody else said, I didn't make it very far actually.
Yeah.
How are we doing on time?
Probably wrap it up now, but there will be.
Okay, well, I'll be around for a little while, so I'm happy to talk after the fact if.
Just a quick comment, you're really close to having this as data, right? Like your model, your equipment as data. That can move around really, right? Like that classic good.
Oh. Okay, well, I think it might be pizza time, but I'm happy to talk afterwards.
Okay.